First of all, we have Fleur Fitzsimons, who is Labour's candidate in the Rongotai election at this year's general election. Hello, Fleur. Fleur has previously been a Wellington City Councillor and a trade union official. Julianne Genter has been a Member of Parliament for the Green Party since 2011. She served as a Minister for Women and Associate Minister of Transport and Health during the previous term, and in that time she led development of the government's emissions reduction policies in transport. And Chris Bishop, welcome Chris, is in his third term as a Member of Parliament and is National Spokesperson for Housing, Urban Development and Infrastructure. He's also Nationals Chair for this year's election campaign and Nationals candidate for Hutt South in this campaign. And there we go, just in case you needed help remembering who they all are. So welcome to you all. I have a microphone and so does Fleur. Hi.
Hello.
So just what we're going to do is hand the microphone along, have a few minutes, and we'll just take it from there. Please, go ahead.
Nā mihi mai o ha tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa, i nā iwi mana whenua o tēnei rohi, tēnā koutou. I want to acknowledge the organisers of today's meeting, the Wellington Regional Leadership Committee. This forum is an important one for our region, and I'm looking forward to hearing from many of the people here today about how it goes. I also want to acknowledge the two Members of Parliament here on this panel, Julianne Genter from the Green Party and Chris Bishop from the National Party. I know you both have a reputation for working hard, and I respect that, and both of you have children younger than me, and you made it here, so well done. I'm proud of Labour's record on supporting our economy and local communities to reduce emissions, and at the same time dealing with and preparing for the impacts of climate change that are already here. Over the past 5.5 years, we've taken more action on climate change than the past 30 years of governments, but there is so much more to do. We are now starting to see results with emissions dropping, and if we keep pushing harder and doing more, we can make sure that emissions stay on a downward trajectory. And I mention this success with reducing emissions deliberately. When I was a Wellington City Councillor, we made important decisions about ensuring Wellington can play its role in reducing emissions through changes to transport, planning rules, and the treatment of sludge. We were able to make these important decisions with fairly broad public support mostly, as people understood that action on climate change was necessary, but also importantly that it did make a difference, that it was worth it. We will not be able to reduce our emissions if people do not see that progress can and is being made and that there is hope. The reality is that we can build on the progress we've made in government and take more urgent action. We still can have a decent chance of avoiding the worst effects of climate change. I want to acknowledge the leadership of the Minister for Climate Change, James Shaw, and for his important contribution to emission reduction, but also for the vision he has for the Climate Change Commission and the role of local government in making sure that New Zealand keeps reducing emissions. The Climate Change Commission is an important institution, and it will be fundamental to the future of us tackling this issue. We need household approaches, neighbourhood approaches, as well as citywide and regional approaches. In terms of a regional approach, the approach is very clear with our government when it comes to how we will get around the region. Our government has committed to a long overdue investment in regional transport, the first major one in 40 years. I'm confident in the vision for Let's Get Wellington Moving, which is for a world-class, low-carbon capital city. We have to address growing congestion, trains and buses which are at capacity, and to make cycling and walking safer. We have to do much better when it comes to resilience to unplanned events, including the increasing prevalence of storms and natural disasters. I appreciate that not everyone agrees with every decision that Let's Get Welly Moving makes. But I would say, when I talk to people about the transport they enjoy when they have lived or travelled overseas, they tell me things which are entirely consistent with the vision for Let's Get Wellington Moving. There have been many other important policy changes we shouldn't forget. We've taken a number of steps to combat harmful materials in our environment, such as banning plastic bags, formerly a significant source of microplastics. We have banned new offshore drilling for fossil fuels. We have co-funded over 1,300 EV chargers. We have made 100,000 homes warmer, drier and more energy efficient. We are decarbonising the public sector to achieve carbon neutrality by 2025. I want to leave you with a final message about the importance of seminars like today, the importance of the work that you all do in this area. It will never be governments alone that reduce emissions. The Climate Change Commission and relevant legislation obviously has a critical role in guiding and holding governments to account. But you, the people in this room, are influential. Your role is really important. We all need to find opportunities and innovation in all areas of our lives to reduce emissions. Thank you for your work, and I wish you all the very best in today's seminar.
Julian. Can you give me a warning after 4 minutes? Oh, because I don't have my timer. Yep. Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. My name is Julianne Genter. I have been an MP for the Green Party since 2011. 17 years ago, I was studying urban and transport planning up in Auckland, and I went on to work as a consultant in that area. The same year, Al Gore's movie An Inconvenient Truth came out, and I was already aware of some of the challenges around climate change, but that made it very, very clear that we had to take action, to do things differently, to stop polluting the atmosphere with a kind of blanket of pollution that could smother us, basically. And I saw that in urban and transport planning, there were huge opportunities not only to reduce pollution, but to get better outcomes for people, to have healthier and happier communities that improved quality of life for people. And many of the things that needed to change were within the hands of government, not individuals and households. So city and regional plans had really great policy statements about what they wanted to achieve, but buried deep in those documents were a whole lot of rules and funding decisions that were leading to the outcomes that we have, which is high car dependence, high pollution, high cost, and congestion that goes with that. And so after a few years of working in the sector, I realized that it was insufficient to have technical solutions and provide that advice to leaders. We actually needed political leadership. And back at that time, the Green Party of Aotearoa, New Zealand, was consistently the only party that was showing that leadership and saying, hey, we need to get on with this. There's so many opportunities to do transport better, renewable electricity, to build our homes warmer and drier. The home insulation program that has been very successful, funded under both national and Labour governments, was started by Fleur Fitzsimons, co-leader of the Green Party, when she was the government spokesperson on energy efficiency and conservation. So since we got into government in 2017, and since we've been sort of outside government, but with a Minister of Climate Change still and a Minister for Family Violence Prevention in the last term, we have been able to make some more practical steps to carry on with the home insulation program, to set up institutions like the Climate Commission, which can provide that independent advice to government. We have brought in a number of policies like the clean car discount, changes with the national policy statement on urban development, which got rid of minimum parking requirements and enabled some more of the kind of density done well that we need to see to provide affordable housing and walkable communities. However, those steps are still sort of baby steps, and I do want to acknowledge all the work you're doing in this regional forum. I do think local and regional levels is the right level to have the kind of planning and consensus building to develop the opportunities for where housing will go, where new communities will be built, how we can retrofit our existing communities to have more homes and more opportunities for people to be able to access the things they need to without having to travel long distances. To improve public transport and prioritize rail, or build on our existing rail spine, and to, as part of both mitigation and adaptation, there's huge opportunities to work with nature. And I'm thinking of wetlands restoration, which will help us deal with increased frequency of rain events. So you're doing wonderful work, but there are still decisions and funding priorities from central government that need to change to really support your work. And that's what I hope we can do in the next government. But I do think we will need more Green MPs and more Green ministers around the cabinet table for that to happen. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thanks, Julianne.
Well, good morning, everyone. Wonderful to be with you all. Just acknowledge Fleur and my colleague, Julianne. Can I firstly just start by saying I think this is a good initiative, great forum. My personal view is we do planning and organisation across the Wellington region particularly poorly. We've got a multiplicity of councils. They don't really work together, and the biggest manifestation of that is in the appalling housing crisis that affects almost every council in the Wellington region. And is a massive source of social inequity. And so we've got to do regional planning better. And so I welcome the Regional Leadership Committee and some of the work they're doing around that. On climate change specifically, as you all know, National signed up to the Zero Carbon Act alongside Labour and the Greens. It was a good moment of cross-party unity in the last Parliament. And I think that's really important because this is bigger than me and Julianne and Fleur, and it's bigger than all of us in this room, and it's going to span across multiple generations. And so having policy certainty and consistency around goals is really important. We signed up to the emissions reduction targets. We're going to disagree about how to get there, but the aims, I think there's broad consensus in the Parliament. Where we're focused on is using price mechanisms and price signals as the primary driver of emissions reduction. So making sure the emissions trading scheme works effectively to drive least cost emissions reductions through the economy. And I was talking to a business the other day actually involved in, it's an emitting industry, put it that way. And he just said, look, the biggest thing you guys in Parliament need to do is make sure the emissions trading scheme has its settings and you stop tinkering. We will make the investments, we will drive the change, but we need policy certainty and stability. And I do think that is really important. From my personal view, the biggest thing we can do as a country is drive renewable energy production in New Zealand. We have an enormous abundance of renewable electricity options to drive the electrification of the economy, to drive electric buses and trains, which we're so blessed with here in the Wellington region and the Hutt Valley, to drive electric cars, take Fonterra off coal and onto electricity produced industrial heat. We need to get the consenting framework right to allow those investments to be made. It takes 8 years to consent a wind farm, it takes 2 years to build one, for example. So we've been promoting this policy called Electrify New Zealand, which aims to double renewable electricity production by 2050, which is what we need to do to drive significant deep emissions reductions. We can grow the economy and reduce emissions at the same time. Just a final comment, which is that we need to be sensible about the investments that we make. There's a lot of things that sound really good, but are a very expensive way of reducing emissions. Clean car schemes, not so much clean cars, but vehicle scrappage schemes, for example, cash for clunkers. They sound appealing. They're very expensive ways of reducing emissions, and it was interesting that the Prime Minister, Chris Hipkins, actually acknowledged that when they scrapped that scheme at the start of the year. So, money is tight. We need to be careful about what we invest in, and as I say, we need to let the emissions trading scheme, which drive the sensible investments that are required and that should be made. That's its primary role. Finally, just on Let's Get Wellington Moving, Fleur. There wouldn't be many people in the Hutt Valley who see it as a regional transport plan. That's the whole problem with it. It's a Wellington City transport plan. Out here in Lower Hutt and Upper Hutt and the wider region, there's very limited public support for it. We have to pay for it, and we don't see much benefit from it. But anyway, we can have an argument about that later.
All right, you can hold on to that. Okay, thank you very much. Let's thank Chris for his opening comments. Now, we asked everybody to submit possible questions for this very short panel discussion, and we got a lot of submissions. Thank you, everybody. We don't have time to go through all of them now, but there are two that we've sort of chosen that we think represent some of the key themes that come through. So I'm going to throw the first one at you. You go back in reverse, exactly. Okay. Thank you. So the first question is, thinking about the latest draft advice to government from the Climate Change Commission, what are one or two recommendations that your party would prioritise?
Yeah, so very quickly, the first is I think it's recommendation 13, they recommend significant uptake of renewable energy generation. So as I just talked about, I think that's a massive opportunity for New Zealand. And it is one of these ones where how do I put this in a way that's not going to annoy Julianne? In a way where our environmental goals sometimes run up against our climate change objectives. So wind farms that affect bird life, for example, or the construction of steel-driven power pylons, new hydroelectric dams, for example. I'm not saying we're going to build massive new dams. In particular, we should get rid of the boondoggle that is Lake Onslow. But small-scale hydro, they have environmental effects. New renewable electricity production has an effect on the environment. Now, we do it for the greater good to reduce emissions, but there are environmental effects, and I think we've got the balance too far in favour of protecting localised environmental effects and not focus enough on the broader issue. Second point is they recommend faster action to incentivise electric vehicle charging. And as someone who almost got trapped in Wanganui on Friday night with my car run out of juice and found the 2 EV chargers in the centre of Wanganui were broken, and I was contemplating spending a night in Wanganui and not able to get back to the Hutt, I fully endorse that, and I think there is a role for government there to accelerate the uptake of chargers, particularly on our state highways.
Thank you, Chris. If you pass that down to Julianne.
Well, I think we need to do everything that the Climate Commission is recommending, and we can do it all. It's just a false choice to think that we have to pick one or two. But the recommendations, obviously the recommendations around carbon price are really important, but that in and of itself isn't going to enable communities to make the changes that they need to make. So I think if you look at the chapter and the recommendations around urban development and transport, that is absolutely critical, and we need a lot more than just EVs and EV chargers. We need a lot more than just renewable electricity. We actually need to look at land use with agriculture, with urban form, and with transport, because if we don't address that, we won't be able to reduce emissions. We won't be very successful in terms of adaptation. And, there's just huge opportunities. So I really disagree with you, Chris, that it's a choice between local environment thriving and renewable electricity. I think that's a kind of 20th century view of things.
I'm just saying it just has new renewables have an environmental local effect.
And the Green Party has long championed wind energy and supporting that to happen. But we do need to take into account the impact on the environment, because life on Earth is all connected. And if we just focus on emissions without focusing on having a thriving natural environment, natural world, protecting nature, we won't be successful for very long.
Well, in terms of priorities, I think they're clear in the actions taken since the draft advice from the Climate Change Commission, particularly the review into the New Zealand Emissions Trading Scheme and into the permanent forestry category. And I think if you look at these reviews, they're based on the premise that we must have the best tools available to help us cut carbon pollution. And the draft advice of the Climate Change Commission is that the current ETS may not be incentivising emissions at source, and I think that's got to be a priority in terms of the next steps.
Thank you. Thanks for that. So the second question that I have, and I think the last for us today before we thank you, is what are your party's plans to ensure that low-income families will not be left behind in the transition to a low-carbon economy?
Yeah, I just wanted to start by genuinely thanking people that put this question up, because I think that low-income people, in my experience of advocating for them, are often forgotten in policy design, no matter what the initial position from the outset. So I think, keep asking this question. It needs to be asked again and again, and then policy proposals need to be scrutinised. throw the overwhelming amount of me. Just saying this question is one that needs to be asked again and again, and policy proposals need to be scrutinised all the time to assess the impact on low-income people. We could easily transition to a low-carbon economy and exacerbate existing inequalities along the way. So if you look at what the government's been doing, it's been working to build a low-carbon future where everyone has a secure income that pays enough to live a good life. And there is a clear link between Labour policies like fair pay agreements and a just transition. Workers need to be able to lead good lives and to be reducing emissions. And if you look at things in the emissions reduction plan, there's a whole range of important policy proposals around supporting people to a low emission society and economy, including educating young people and embedding an understanding of the collective nature of our well-being, which supports social cohesion, and a focus on curiosity and critical thinking and citizenship, so young people develop the skills and capabilities to work together, solve problems and take action. And there's a whole range of other areas around industry workforce development, councils, support for retraining, people out of high-emission jobs into low-emission jobs. But I think it's critical that we have meaningful engagement from a broad range of interests, particularly workers, unions, women, education providers, local government, disabled people, and of course Māori, Pacifica and beneficiary households, because making sure that those voices are heard is the best way to ensure that we have a genuinely just transition.
Thank you. Julian, I'm actually going to swap mics with you.
Oh, okay. Great. The Green Party recently announced our minimum guaranteed income, our income guarantee, which can be funded by changes to make our tax system fair. And I think addressing inequality by ensuring that everybody has enough to make ends meet is critical so that people are able to participate in society as we make these transitions. So while I agree with everything Fleur has said, I do think that the current government has really fallen short in that area by, one, earlier this year, they ignored the advice of the Climate Commission because in the run-up to the election with cost of living pressures, they didn't want to see low-income families face higher prices. And so, we had the cut to the petrol tax for over a year, which cost over $1 billion. And then we had the changes to the ETS, which cost $800 million in terms of the floor falling out of the carbon price. We have to address inequality, and we can do that. And the Greens have shown a very clear policy that would enable us to do that. That would mean that every person in Aotearoa has enough to put kai on the table, to have a warm, dry home. And of course, there's more we can do to make sure that transport is affordable, to make sure that they are able to access electric vehicles if they need them, to make sure that we have more affordable renewable electricity and more energy efficient homes so they need less electricity to have a warm, dry home. I'd encourage you, if you haven't already looked at it, to look at the Greens income guarantee. I think it's really unfortunate that the Labour leader didn't take the opportunity at the budget to make fair changes to the tax system that would ensure that everybody is contributing, and those that are the most well-off and most able to contribute are actually paying the same sort of effective tax rate that nurses and teachers and cleaners are.
I'm going to resist the temptation to get stuck in on the wealth tax, and I'll answer the question, which I think related to, when I read the long form of it, it was stuff about how we can stop low-income people being trapped into hot, expensive and inefficient modes of heating and things like that. So I'm going to say something that you probably don't expect, which is that there's a really clear role for regulation here. The way in which I mean that is by setting standards for things like for heat pumps, for the way in which for cars as well, that is a very important way of driving up standards and driving a more efficient economy. A lot of people don't know that Julianne does, but many people don't know that the government goes through this convoluted process with the Australian state governments every year or so, it might be every 2 years, to set minimum energy efficiency standards for things like TVs, vacuum cleaners, literally almost anything in your house, and then just basically bans the stuff below a certain standard, and you just can't find them in New Zealand. That the net benefits to the New Zealand economy from doing that are in the order of magnitude of hundreds of millions of dollars annually. And so, I'm a National Party politician. Sensible regulation has a place. Those are sensible regulations. I'd also point to some of the work that Julianne's done on the Clean Car Standard around fuel economy standards. That has a role to play as well. I think we disagree on the aggression with which you would implement it, but the general concept is supported, and I think those are really important. At a more broad level, there is clearly going to be an issue in the next 30 years as the carbon price goes higher, and there are people who are increasingly unable to afford to pay what that means. And there is clearly a role for government around recycling of some of that revenue that the government receives to help people who can't otherwise afford it ease the transition. There is clearly a role for government around that. I think it's an open question as to the best way to do that. But there is clearly going to be a role in terms of ensuring social equity as we make that transition.
Thank you very much. Look, it's 9:45 and I know that you are busy and need to kind of go on with your business, but can I just ask everybody to thank our political panellists very much for coming along. Thank you. Yeah, thanks. Nice to see you. Yeah, you too. Thank you.